You can set everything down now. Whatever you are carrying today, the decisions, the small frictions, the things you still meant to do, you can let them rest where they are. They will be there if you need them later. But for now, you are not needed anywhere. There's nothing to solve, nothing to finish, nothing to check. All that is required of you in this moment is to be still. Find your most comfortable position. Let your shoulders drop just a little toward the surface beneath you. Feel how it holds you without asking anything in return. Feel the weight of your head, your arms, your legs, surrendering gently downward. If there is tension anywhere in your body, you do not need to force it away. Simply notice it, the way you might notice a cloud passing, and let it drift. Breathe in slowly, and breathe out just a little longer than you breathed in. Again, in through the nose, cool and quiet, and out, warm and slow, like water moving over a smooth stone. Good. You can keep breathing just like that, or you can let your breath find its own pace. Either way is right. There's a place I would like to take you. It is far from here and very quiet, and the light there is the color of old glass. It is a place where the water barely moves, where the air smells of cold iron and open sea, and where, if you are very still, you can hear, faintly from somewhere across the water, the low, unhurried voice of a bell. Let your eyes close, if they haven't already. Let the sounds around you soften into background. You are safe. You are warm. You are already, in some small way, beginning to drift. Come with me now, out to the Nacre Shelf, where the evening is beginning. The first thing you notice is the light. It arrives low and without urgency across a sea so flat and still that it hardly seems like a sea at all, more like a single enormous pane of green glass, faintly luminous from somewhere beneath its surface, as though the last of the afternoon has pooled down into the shallow water and is now glowing up through it from below. The color is difficult to name, not the vivid turquoise of tropical shallows, and not the cold gray blue of open ocean. It is something quieter than either of those, a pale, muted green, the color of sea glass worn smooth by years of tumbling along a shore, or the color of old copper just beginning to turn. It shifts as you watch it, depending on where the light falls and where it doesn't, depending on the depth of the sand below. Here, in the shallows, you can see the bottom clearly. Ribbed patterns of sand, rippled by slow currents into long, soft ridges, their shadows lying blue and wavering along their leeward sides. The shadows move, but only just. Everything here moves, but only just. The Nacre Shelf extends around you in every direction, not so far that you lose the sense of land entirely, but far enough that the shore behind you has shrunk to a pale thread on the horizon, a suggestion of dunes and scrub grass, barely distinguishable from the low clouds that sit above it. Ahead of you, and to either side, there's only the water, the sky, and the buoys. They are scattered across the shelf in a loose, unhurried arrangement, the way thoughts scatter before sleep. Not random, exactly, but not planned either. Some are clustered in loose groups of 3 or 4, their shapes dark against the pale water. Others float in solitude, a quarter mile from their nearest neighbor. They are old iron buoys, each one rounded and slightly flattened at the crown, their hulls painted at some point in their histories with red or black or dark green, though the paint has aged now into something softer, a weathered, salt-bleached version of what it once was, as though the sea has been gently working on them, rounding their colors the way it rounds stones. Near the waterline, each hull wears a hem of dark weed and a scattering of small barnacles, pale as fingernails. Above the waterline, the iron is dry and faintly chalky with brine crystal, and at the crown of each buoy, fitted to a pivot and rigged with a clapper on a short chain, hangs a bell. They are bronze, mostly, or they were once, before decades of salt air turned them the deep, uneven amber green of old coins. Each one is a different size. Each one has been tuned at some point by careful hands to a different interval, a slightly different pitch, a slightly different voice. The bells do not ring constantly. They ring when the water moves them, when a slow swell travels beneath the surface and sets the buoy swaying, just enough to swing the clapper against the bell's interior. The sound that results is not sharp. It is low and spreading, the way a voice sounds in a large stone room. It leaves the bell and travels outward across the water in concentric rings you cannot see, softening as it goes, until by the time it reaches you, it has become almost more of a feeling than a sound, a resonance, a low hum in the chest, and then silence, long, slow silence, full of the shelf wind and the creak of things resting at anchor. And then, from a different direction, slightly different in pitch, another bell sounds. You are standing on the stern deck of the tender, a flat-bottomed vessel, low-sided and deliberate in its design, built for exactly this shallow shelf water where deeper-keeled boats cannot go. The deck planks beneath your feet are worn smooth, pale gray with age and salt, and they are faintly damp from the sea spray of the afternoon. The vessel smells of iron and rope and something faintly mineral, the particular smell of cold water and wet metal that has no equivalent on land. There is a lantern mounted near the wheelhouse, a small oil lantern in a glass housing, and in the falling evening, it has just become bright enough to cast a circle of amber light on the planks around it, warm and steady, rocking almost imperceptibly as the tender moves on the water's subtle breath. The keeper is near the bow. She has her back to you, a compact figure in a long canvas coat, the color of oiled linen, that falls to just above her boot tops. Her hair is tucked under a knitted cap, the color of undyed wool, slightly misshapen from years of use. She is bent over a small folding table that is bolted to the deck rail, and she is writing something, or finishing writing something, in a ledger. The ledger is thick, its pages made of a compressed felt-like material, soft and slightly textured, that holds pencil marks without smearing, and does not warp or cockle in the damp air the way ordinary paper would. You can hear, very faintly, the soft sound of her pencil moving across those pages, a dry, whispered sound, almost like a distant brushstroke. Then the pencil stops. She straightens. She closes the ledger with both hands, pressing gently on its cover for a moment, the way you might press a hand to the top of a letter before sending it away. She tucks the ledger under her arm. She smells of supper, rice, and something bright and citrusy, a preserved citrus rind she'd tucked into the meal, and the faint, sweet, sour smell of it still lingers on her fingers where she handled the peel. It mingles with the brine and the iron and the cold evening air, and the combination is unexpectedly pleasant. The sweetness of the citrus, the mineral sharpness of the sea, the slight warmth of a recently inhabited cabin behind the wheelhouse door. She looks out across the water. Somewhere to the north, one of the buoys shifts in a slow swell, and a bell sounds. A low, spreading tone, a voice made of bronze and distance, arriving across the glassy surface with a gentleness that seems deliberate, as though the sea itself is being careful not to disturb the evening. The keeper tilts her head very slightly. Her expression does not change, but something in the set of her shoulders eases, almost imperceptibly, the way a held breath releases. She knows the voice of that bell. She has known it for years. It is the buoy she calls the third northern cluster, and its tone lands a full interval below the one nearest the tender, a low, almost moaning note that seems to travel through the hull of the boat as much as through the air. She sets the ledger inside the wheelhouse, pulls on her canvas coat more snugly. You hear the faint rub of canvas on canvas, the cold sleeve pressing against her wrist as she adjusts the cuff. And she moves toward the stern, where the small dinghy rides in a cradle of rope. She does not hurry. There is no urgency in the autumn drift, only the steady, patient rhythm of work that returns in its own season, the way the warm underflow current returns, the way the buoys begin their unhurried migration northward without any announcement, simply moving, simply drifting, a few feet each day, pulling gently at their lines until the lines go slack and the long arc of the drift begins. She unties the dinghy and lowers it to the water. She steps down into it with the ease of long practice, no hesitation, no awkwardness, and settles on to the center thwart. She takes up the oars, and then, very slowly, very quietly, she begins to row. The oars enter the water with almost no sound, a soft resistance, a slight gurgle as the blade catches and pulls, and then the creak of the oarlocks as the handle comes back, and the small musical drip of water falling from the lifted blade back to the surface. Creak, drip, creak, drip. The sound is steady and unhurried, like a slow heartbeat, like breathing, like the rhythm of something that has been going on for a very long time and will continue going on long after you have stopped listening. The tender grows smaller behind you. The amber circle of its lantern shimmers on the water, pulling away with each stroke until it is simply a warm point of light in the gathering dusk, stationary while everything else drifts. You are in the dinghy with her, or perhaps you are the dinghy, or the water. Perhaps you are simply present here, riding the glassy surface, watching the first buoy approach. It grows from a dark shape on the water to a solid rounded form. The iron hull, dark with age, trailing its hem of weed, and as the dinghy closes the distance, the bell begins to take shape too. The bronze curve of it, verdigris patched, suspended just above the crown of the buoy, swaying almost imperceptibly. The keeper ships one oar and reaches out with a practiced hand to catch the buoy's handling ring. The dinghy bumps gently against the hull, a soft iron thud, and she holds them together there for a moment, letting everything settle. The smell reaches you then. Cold iron, brine, the slightly acrid smell of wet weed, and beneath it all a deeper mineral smell, the smell of water that has been in the same place for a long time, slow and deep and patient. She pulls a small tin of oil from her coat pocket. She uncaps it with a thumbnail, a faint metallic click, and applies a few careful drops to the pivot at the top of the bell's mounting arm, working the arm back and forth gently until the movement is smooth again. You can hear the difference. Before, there was the faintest resistance, a nearly imperceptible binding in the metal. After, the arm swings free and loose, responsive to even the gentlest motion of the water, and the clapper inside taps the bell's inner curve with a softness that releases a tone like a sigh. She wipes the brine crystals from the bell's lip with a cloth, working in slow circles, and then she takes the tuning reed from her coat pocket, a small, flat sliver of shaped brass that produces a single reference pitch when she holds it against her teeth and breathes, and she holds it there for a moment, listening, comparing. The bell's tone and the reed's tone blend and separate, like two voices deciding whether to harmonize. She makes a small adjustment to the clapper's hanging point with a turn of a brass nut and sounds the bell again, a tap with one knuckle. And this time, the two tones settle together without beating against each other, and the sound that results is clean and whole and quietly beautiful. She opens the ledger across her knee. The felt pages whisper as she turns to her place. She writes something in pencil, the buoy's number, its position, its tone, and the soft sound of the pencil on those pages carries across the water almost as far as the bell's voice did. Then she closes the ledger, tucks it under her arm again, releases the handling ring, and takes up the oars. Creak, drip, creak, drip. The dinghy moves on. The second buoy is 50 yards to the northwest, and by the time she reaches it, the sky has deepened from pale gold at the horizon to a soft, layered blue overhead. Not dark yet, but committed to becoming dark. The blue deepening steadily by degrees, the way a breath deepens as you settle towards sleep. The first star has appeared directly above, a single point of cool white light, so faint you might think it imagined if you looked away. But if you keep your eyes on it, it is there, steady, unhurried, very far away. The second buoy has a different voice. Where the first was low and rounded, this one rings slightly higher, not quite bright, still warm, but with a clarity the first one didn't have. A note that seems to come from somewhere more defined, more immediate. It sounds as the dinghy approaches, set swaying by the wake of their arrival, and the tone spreads out across the water, and the keeper pauses her rowing for a moment, simply listening, her oar blades resting flat on the surface and dripping their quiet drips into the silence around the bell's decay. The note lasts a long time, much longer than you might expect. The water here is so still that there is almost nothing to absorb it, and it travels and travels, thinning and thinning, until you cannot be sure whether you are still hearing it or simply remembering it. She works the second buoy as she worked the first. A few drops of oil to the pivot, a wipe with a cloth, the tuning reed between her teeth, the adjustments made with patient fingers, the entry in the soft felt ledger. But here, she pauses longer. She rests one hand on the bell's curve, the bronze cool and slightly rough under her palm, and she looks out over the water in the direction of the third cluster, half a mile to the north. From here, in the near dark, the buoys of the third cluster are just barely visible. 3 low shapes on the water, indistinct, like sleeping birds. As she watches, one of them sounds, and the low tone rolls toward her across the glassy surface, arriving late, arriving gently, filling the space between the dinghy and the horizon with its slow and patient voice. She pats the bell once, lightly, a small, fond gesture, the gesture of someone acknowledging something that has been reliable, and releases her grip on the buoy and takes up the oars again. Creak, drip, creak, drip. The smell of brine is constant now, underlying everything, as familiar and unobtrusive as the smell of your own sheets. The smell that the air itself seems made of here, as though the word for air and the word for salt are the same word in this place's language. Beneath it, occasionally, the cold iron smell sharpens as she passes close to a buoy's hull, and then softens again as the dinghy moves past. Once, a small drift of weed passes beneath the hull. You can hear it brush the planking below the waterline, a soft, barely there sound, and for a moment, the smell of it is green and dark and alive. The third cluster takes time to reach. She rows steadily, unhurriedly, and the dinghy cuts a long, slow arc across the surface of the shelf, leaving a V of gentle wake that spreads and flattens and is gone almost before it has fully formed. The water here is very clear. Even in the fading light, you can see the sand bottom below, those long, slow ripples moving under the surface like the memory of a wind, like breathing. In some places, the sand ripples cast faint blue shadows, and in others the surface reflects the pale gold remnant of the western sky. And the combination of reflected sky and visible bottom creates a sense of infinite depth and infinite shallowness at the same time, as though the water is both very near and very far away, as though you could reach through it and touch the sand below, or reach up through it and touch the stars. One of the third cluster buoys sounds as she approaches, the low, moaning note she heard from the tender, the one that resonates in the chest rather than the ears. It sounds and fades, and then the second one of the cluster answers it, a tone a third above, and the two voices overlap briefly before the first has fully dissolved, and the interval they make together is neither happy nor sad. It is something that has no other name than itself. The sound of two old things resting near each other in the dark, patient and unhurried and complete. Then the third buoy sounds, a beat later, and you have three tones in the air at once, each at a different stage of its decay. One still full and warm, one thinning, one barely a shimmer at the edge of hearing. And then they are all gone, and there is only the creak of the oars and the small drip of water and the shelf wind, low and distant, moving somewhere far above the surface. She works all three of the cluster buoys in turn. She is unhurried. She moves from one to the next with the same steady patience, the same deliberate hands, the small tin of oil, the cloth, the tuning reed, the pencil on the felt pages. At the second buoy of the cluster, she finds that the clapper chain has gathered a twist, a full rotation of tangled links that would, in time, shorten the clapper's swing and mute the bell's voice. She works the twist out with 2 fingers, slowly rotating the chain back until it hangs straight and easy, and she sounds the bell to confirm. 2 taps of a knuckle, first the twisted configuration, and then the corrected one, and the difference is audible. The corrected bell opening up into a fuller, rounder sound, like a room when a window is opened. She makes a small note in the ledger, not a complaint, just a notation, the record of a small thing attended to, and moves on. Between the third cluster and the outer buoys, there's a stretch of open shelf where nothing floats, no buoy, no debris, just the pale green water and the sand below and the deepening sky above. She rows through it in a comfortable silence. The lantern on the tender is visible still, far behind her, a warm amber point that bobs very gently with the vessel's movement. Ahead, the outer buoys are barely visible. 1 or 2 dark shapes at the edge of the deepening dusk, with no light of their own to mark them, except the faint shine of the water against their hulls. She does not use a compass. She does not need one. She has made this circuit so many times that the distances and directions are part of her body, the way familiar roads are part of the body, known not through thought, but through the feeling of moving, through the slight adjustment of the wrists, the angle of the oar stroke, the way the shelf wind comes from slightly left of north, and she corrects for it without thinking. The dinghy moves as an extension of her movement, as her breathing moves as an extension of something deeper and older than intention. There is a long, quiet passage here, in the middle of the open water. The bells are all behind her now, the cluster bells sounding occasionally as the swell shifts them, their voices reaching her across the growing distance. Lower now, softer, carrying less of their pitch and more of their resonance, as though the distance strips away the note and leaves only the warmth of it, the way distance softens all voices into something more like memory than sound. She rows, and the oars creak, and the water drips from the blades, and somewhere behind her a bell sounds and fades, and the night deepens by another degree. You notice the citrus smell again, on the air around her, on the cold canvas of her coat sleeve, where her wrist rests against the oar handle, the preserved citrus peel she had with her supper, the brightness of it, the way it lingered on her fingers. It is still there, very faint now, a memory of warmth and sweetness carried into this cold, salt and iron world. It is a small thing, but it is the kind of small thing that stays with you, the way a meal stays, not in the fullness, but in the smell, not in the taste, but in the warmth of having been fed, of having been, for a time, inside and warm, while the outside waited patiently. The first of the outer buoys appears from the dark, like something surfacing slowly from below. The rounded iron crown, the bell just catching the last of the western light in a faint bronze gleam. She ships the oars and lets the dinghy coast the last few yards, reaching out at the right moment with a natural ease to catch the handling ring. And the hull of the dinghy meets the hull of the buoy with that same soft iron thud, muffled, low, like a single note struck on something very large. The outer buoys are older than the cluster bells. You can feel the age of them in the weight of the iron, in the thickness of the barnacle layer along the waterline, in the way the paint has retreated so thoroughly into the metal that there is no longer any clear boundary between them. This buoy has been on the shelf longer than the keeper has been the keeper. It was here before her. It will, in all likelihood, be here after her. There's something in that thought that is not sad at all, but solid, reassuring, the way old things that have survived many winters are reassuring, not because they are permanent, but because they have already proven their patience. She works the outer buoy carefully, taking her time. The pivot here is stiffer than the others, years of slow oxidation, of salt working into the joint. And she applies the oil generously and works the mounting arm back and forth with both hands, not forcing it, just coaxing, the way you coax a cold muscle, with warmth and repetition and patience. Gradually, the resistance eases. The arm begins to swing more freely. She sounds the bell, a tap, then a longer one, and the tone that comes out is remarkably full for a bell. This old, a deep, round sound, almost a vibration more than a note, felt in the sternum, felt in the hands where they rest on the cold iron rim, the tuning reed between her teeth, the two tones, reed and bell, comparing themselves to each other in the still air. A small adjustment, another tap. The tones settle. She writes in the ledger. The pencil moves across the felt pages, and the sound of it is soft and continuous for a moment. She is writing more here, more notes, more observations. And you cannot read what she writes, but the quality of the writing has a different rhythm than the brief notations at the other buoys. This buoy warrants more attention, not because anything is wrong, but because everything is right, and some things deserve to be witnessed more carefully. Between the first and second outer buoys, she pauses rowing entirely. She ships both oars and simply rests, her hands in her lap, her head slightly tilted back, looking at the sky. And you look too. It is fully dark now, or nearly. The last violet remnant of the western sky has compressed itself into a thin ribbon just above the horizon, and above that ribbon, the darkness deepens through blue and indigo into the true black of a clear night sky over open water. The stars are out in abundance, not 1 or 2 or 10, but hundreds, thousands, the shelf being far enough from any land light that the sky here is what the sky is meant to be, what it has always been, what people used to navigate by when they needed something steady and reliable to follow. There are stars in configurations you half recognize, and stars you've never noticed before. And there are dense smudges of faint light where the stars are too numerous and too close together to be distinguished individually. And there are very dark patches between them that are darker than you expect. A depth of darkness that is not empty, but full of something at too great a distance to be perceived. She breathes slowly. Her breath mists slightly in the cold night air, rising and dispersing. The dinghy drifts a few feet on the shelf's imperceptible current, and the sound of the distant bells, the cluster bells far behind, the outer bells ahead, arrives from multiple directions at once, overlapping and non-overlapping. A slow, a rhythmic conversation of bronze tones, each at its own stage of decay. You listen to the pattern of them. There is no pattern, or the pattern is too slow and complex to follow consciously, like the pattern of weather or the pattern of stars, and that is restful, not frustrating. You do not need to find the pattern. There is no pattern to find. There is only the sound and the silence between the sounds, and the silence is as full as the sound. After a while, after a long, unmeasured while, she picks up the oars again. Creak, drip, creak, drip. The dinghy moves forward into the dark. The second outer buoy is smaller than the first. A scout buoy, she thinks of it, placed at the northern edge of the cluster to mark the furthest reach of the drift before the season turns and the current reverses. It has a high, clear voice, this one, the highest of all the buoys on the shelf, a note that cuts through the dark with a purity that seems to come from smallness, from being close to a single, particular thing. It sounds as she approaches, set in motion by the small wave of her dinghy's bow wake, and the tone rises and hangs over the water and decays slowly, slowly, like a note held on a breath and released only when the breath is finally completely spent. She oils the pivot. She wipes the lip. She checks the clapper. Everything here is well. This buoy is newer than the others, its joints still limber, its bell still bright beneath the verdigris, the clapper hanging straight and responsive. She makes a brief notation in the ledger and moves on. Now she turns the dinghy. The tender, far away, is still visible by its lantern, a warm amber point, steady and small, like a low star that has chosen to rest on the water. She does not row toward it yet. There is one more buoy, the last one, the oldest one, the one she has been, without quite thinking about it, saving for the end. She turns the dinghy northward, slightly north of where the second outer buoy sits, and rows toward a dark shape on the water that is barely visible, but that she has been watching all evening from the corner of her attention. It is larger than the others, older. The barnacle layer on its hull is thicker, more elaborate, and along one flank, the leeward side where the growth is most protected from the weather, there's a spiral of barnacles that she has been watching for 3 years now, noting in the ledger each time she comes, the spiral's progress, the way it extends itself by small increments, the way it follows the curve of the hole, as though it is drawing a map of the buoy's old iron skin. As she approaches, something happens to the light. The sky above is now so fully dark, and the stars so fully present, and the water so perfectly still, that the reflections in the surface below her oar blades have become indistinguishable from the stars themselves. Where the sky is dark between stars, the water is dark between stars. Where a cluster of stars burns overhead, its mirror burns below. The dinghy moves through the middle of it, above the stars, below the stars on every side, and the sensation is of floating in something much larger than water, much older than night. There is no horizon, there is no surface, there's only the stars, above and below and all around, and the steady creak of the oars, and the soft drip of water from the blades, and the very faint bell voices from across the shelf, arriving from the dark, the way all very distant sounds arrive, gently, without demanding to be heard, simply present, simply themselves. The oldest buoy is 30 yards ahead now, and she ships the oars and lets the dinghy glide the last of the distance. The bell sounds without provocation. No wave from the dinghy's wake has reached it yet, and the shelf is still. And yet, the bell sounds, a single low tone, deeper than any of the others. So deep, it is almost below the range of what you think of as hearing, and more in the range of what you think of as feeling. A resonance in the ribcage, a warmth in the sternum, a slow vibration that moves through the dinghy's hull and up through the thwart and into the body without effort. She catches the handling ring. The iron is very cold, colder than the other buoys. The oldest iron holds cold the way the oldest stone holds cold, deeply and faithfully, as though it has been storing it for exactly this moment. She holds the ring in both hands for a moment, not beginning her work yet, just resting in the contact between her palms and the cold iron, between the warmth she carries and the cold the buoy carries. Then she begins. She is slower here than at the other buoys, not because the work is harder, though the pivot is stiff and the oil goes in generously, slowly worked into the joint with patient repeated strokes of the arm, but slower because this buoy asks for that, because after 3 years of visits, she and this buoy have an understanding, the kind of understanding that doesn't need to be spoken or acknowledged, that simply exists in the way she moves, and the way the buoy receives her attention, without urgency, without hurry, with the particular quality of attention that can only be paid by someone who is not, in this moment, thinking about anything else. She oils the pivot. She works it loose. She wipes the bell. The bronze is rougher here than on the newer bells, textured with age and salt and time. The verdigris thicker, more elaborate, full of small variations in color, from pale green to deep teal, to a faint, nearly black shadow at the lowest point of the curve, where water has pooled and slowly dried, again and again and again, for years. She runs her thumb along the lip of the bell, feeling for irregularities, finding none. This bell is as true as it has always been, the age of it having done nothing to the fundamental accuracy of its shape, the way the fundamental accuracy of very old things is often their most remarkable quality. The tuning reed. She holds it between her teeth, breathes, and the reference tone sounds. Quiet, clear, precise. She taps the bell with a knuckle. The deep tone moves through the air, through the water, through the dinghy, through her, through you. A slow, full vibration, warm as firelight, steady as the stars. The two tones, the reed and the bell, find each other in the still air and confirm what has always been true. This bell is in tune. This bell has always been in tune. She does not adjust anything. She simply makes the note in the ledger, the pencil on the soft felt pages, the quiet scrape of the graphite, the small sound of something being confirmed and recorded. And she closes the ledger and rests it in the bow of the dinghy. She looks at the Barnacle Spiral. She leans close enough that her face is near the iron hull, and in the starlight, which is, she has discovered over 3 years, enough light for this, barely but genuinely enough. She traces the spiral's progress with her eyes. Since last season, it has extended itself by what she estimates is the width of 2 fingernails. She has recorded the distance in the ledger each year, and the spiral continues, outward and northward, following the curve of the hull, drawing its patient map. She does not touch it. She never touches it. It is not hers to touch. It is the buoy's thing, grown out of the buoy's long, patient existence in this place, grown out of years of still water and slow current, and the particular chemistry of this iron and this sea. She is only the observer. She is, in the best sense of the word, only the keeper. She straightens. She looks out over the water. From here, the whole shelf is visible. Or rather, the whole shelf is audible, because the dark has closed down the visible world to the near and the very near, the dinghy, the buoy, the stars reflected in the water, the amber point of the tender's lantern far away. But the bells are everywhere. From the south, the cluster bells, low, warm, occasional, sound their slow, irregular conversation. From the east, one of the outer buoys, the first one, the older one, sounds its deep, resonant voice, and the tone travels across the water and reaches the oldest buoy, and the oldest buoy's bell stirs in response. Not a ring, just a tremor, just a faint harmonic, like an echo arriving before the sound. And then the scout buoy, small and clear, from the northeast, its high, pure tone cutting through the dark, lasting its long, held breath, decaying into nothing. And then silence, a long silence, a silence that is not absence, but presence, the presence of all the tones that have sounded and not quite fully disappeared, the resonance still in the air, the memory of sound that is indistinguishable at this depth of quiet, from sound itself. She exhales slowly. Her breath mists and rises and disappears into the star-filled air above her. She reaches into the dinghy and lifts out the wool blanket she brought, folded thick, stored under the center thwart. She shakes it open and wraps it around her shoulders, pulling it close, and the immediate warmth of it, the retained warmth of the tender's cabin where it spent the day, is remarkable against the cold night air. The wool is dense and slightly scratchy at the edges, but soft in the middle, where it has been pressed and folded for years, and it smells faintly of the tender, of wood and lantern oil, and the accumulated warmth of closed spaces. She draws it tighter, and the canvas coat is underneath, and the body warmth inside the canvas coat is underneath that, and the layers of warmth are like layers of sleep, each one deeper than the last, each one more complete, each one further from the cold. She ties the dinghy to the oldest buoy's handling ring, a loose knot, nothing that would hold against weather. But this is not weather. This is the stillest night of the autumn. This is the kind of night that asks nothing of you. She settles herself more comfortably on the center thwart, the blanket wrapped close, her boots on the dinghy's keel boards, and she leans back against the stern seat and simply rests there, half sitting and half lying, looking up at the stars. The dinghy drifts very slightly on the end of its mooring line. The oldest buoy drifts very slightly on the slow beginning of the autumn current that is even now, even tonight, beginning to move northward through the shelf. The warm underflow from somewhere below and south, rising through the sand and traveling upward and outward, moving everything on the surface with it in a long, slow, imperceptible arc that will take all winter to complete and end somewhere north of here, in waters she has never visited, but imagines sometimes, on nights like this, when the current is just beginning, and everything on the shelf is beginning to move. A bell sounds, one of the cluster bells, from somewhere behind her to the south. The low, moaning note, the resonant chest note. It sounds and spreads, and the spreading is nearly visible in the still water, the concentric rings of sound moving out across the surface, carrying their warmth. She lets her eyes close for a moment, not sleeping, just resting behind closed eyelids, just letting the sound arrive without looking at where it comes from. Another bell, the first outer buoy, east of her. The deep, old voice, the voice that lives in the sternum. It arrives, and she receives it without moving, without responding, just receiving. The way you receive warmth from a fire when you are already warm enough, not needing it, but grateful for it, glad it exists. Then silence, a long, slow silence, full of the shelf wind high above, and the faint creak of the dinghy's line, and the nearly inaudible sound of the water moving. Not waves, not swells, just the surface of the water continuously, infinitely adjusting itself to the forces acting on it. The current, the air, the slow rotation of everything below. The citrus smell is still there, very faint now. She has been out for a long time in the cold air and the salt air, and the citrus on her fingers has been diluted by brine and iron and cloth. But it is there, a thread of brightness beneath everything else. The memory of supper, of warmth, of the amber-lit cabin and the bowl of rice, and the moment of sitting still before the evening's work began. It will be gone entirely by the time she rows back to the tender, but for now, it is still present, still recognizable, a small, warm thing persisting in the cold. The stars in the water below the dinghy move very slowly as the dinghy turns on its mooring line. First, the northern sky is below you, the dense star clouds of the north reflected in the still surface. And then, as the dinghy turns, slowly, over many minutes, the eastern sky appears, and then the southern, and then the western, where the last of the violet ribbon has finally, completely disappeared, and the western sky is now as full of stars as all the others, and there's no direction that is not full of stars, above or below. She breathes in cold air, salt air, iron air, the very faint ghost of citrus, and the very faint ghost of supper's warmth. She breathes out. Her misted breath rises and is immediately indistinguishable from the darkness around it. No longer breath, no longer anything in particular, just air, returning to air. A bell sounds, far away. One of the southernmost cluster bells, she thinks, though at this distance and at this depth of night, it is hard to be certain of direction. The tone arrives softened by its journey. Most of the higher frequencies lost in transit, only the lowest component remaining. A slow throb of sound at the edge of hearing, warm and deep and already fading, even as it arrives. It fades. It is gone. The silence that follows is very full. She draws the blanket up around her shoulders more completely, and the warmth inside it deepens, and the night air outside it is cold and clear and very still. And the difference between the warmth inside and the cold outside is not uncomfortable. It is, in fact, the precise quality of comfort that needs contrast to be fully felt. The cold at the tip of her nose, the warmth of the wool against her neck, the canvas coat between them, holding the layer of trapped warmth that is her own warmth, returned to her. Her eyes open a little, not wide, just the small, heavy-lidded openness of someone not quite ready to close them all the way, and she looks at the stars above her, the actual stars, not the reflected ones, and the actual stars are as still and numerous and far away as they have always been. The bells continue their slow, arrhythmic conversation across the shelf. There is no urgency in their timing. The longest silence between two bells is, this evening, nearly 4 minutes. 4 minutes of complete bell silence, filled only with the shelf wind and the water creak and the distant, formless murmur of the world going on. And then a bell from the east sounds, clear and unhurried, and its tone fills the 4-minute silence, the way a single candle fills a dark room, completely, without effort, from a very small source. She does not count the silences. She does not track the bells. She is simply here, present on the end of a mooring line, wrapped in wool, floating between the stars above and the stars below, in the company of an old iron buoy that has been floating in this place since before she was born, and will, in all likelihood, continue floating here long after her accounting of its pivot and its barnacle spiral and its deep, true tone has become a set of entries in a ledger that no longer has a keeper to open it. And that is not a sad thought. It is the same thought as the barnacle spiral, the thought of things continuing, of work being taken up and laid down and taken up again by other hands, of the shelf being here in 10 years and 100 years, and the bells sounding in the dark for anyone who happens to be out on the water, resting in a dinghy, wrapped in wool, listening. Now the stars above and the stars below have grown very still. The dinghy is barely moving on its line. The current is so slow that it is more like intention than motion. The shelf deciding very quietly to carry everything northward and beginning, very quietly, to act on that decision. A bell sounds. It is far away, very far away. She has drifted far enough that even the nearest cluster bell sounds distant now, its tone arriving stripped of most of its particular character, only the fundamental remaining. A low, slow pulse of bronze warmth spreading across the water, arriving gently, asking nothing. It fades. Silence. And in the silence, the sound of the water. Not waves, just the surface, the continuous micro-motion of the surface, the barely audible sound of water being water, of the shelf going on being the shelf, of the world continuing to do what the world does, slowly and without urgency, and without any need for witness. Your breathing has slowed. You may have noticed this without noticing it. The way the breath, when left to itself, when not asked to do anything, when not needed for speech or exertion, gradually settles into something deeper and wider than what it usually is. Not forced, not controlled, just arriving at its own natural depth, the depth it has been moving toward all evening, since the first bell sounded and the first star appeared, and the dinghy pushed off from the tender into the pale green stillness of the early night. The warmth of the wool blanket is everywhere now. The cold at the tip of the nose is pleasant, clean and sharp and very present, and the rest of the body is warm, deeply warm, the layered warmth of wool and canvas, and the body's own patient heat. The center thwart is no longer hard. The dinghy no longer feels small. Everything has settled into itself. The old iron buoy, patient on its drift, the still water, the star-filled sky above, and the star-filled sky below, the far bells sounding their slow, irregular notes. A bell, very far, low, fading. The keeper's eyes are closed. She is not asleep, not quite, but she is in the place that is not quite awake and not quite asleep, the threshold place, where the sounds of the world are still present, but have become something closer to sensation than information. The bell sounds. The sound enters. It does not ask to be understood. It asks only to be received. And it is received. The stars above are very still. The stars below are very still. The dinghy drifts north, almost imperceptibly, north. A bell, somewhere, very far. The smell of cold iron, the smell of salt, very faint, citrus, warmth, the wool blanket, warm. A bell, fading, the water, the stars, drifting, north, very slowly,